Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlene Margot. I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are delighted to welcome Amanda Morin to tonight's beginning of season 2 of the Neurodiversity Education Series. She will be talking to you about understanding neurodiversity and neurodivergence, creating a more empathetic, accessible world. Please join me in a really warm welcome for Amanda Morin. Take it away, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Charlene. And you all will have to bear with me for just a moment as I share my screen. Um, and and we'll be off and having a great conversation. Give me just one moment here. So, thank you. So before I get started, I just really want to thank the Parent Venture, CHC, Compass High School, Real 2E, and the Riley Project, and of course the Sequoia Health District for inviting me to kick off this season of the Neurodiversity Education Series. Last season had some amazing, informative, and accomplished speakers, and I'm so grateful and honored to join the ranks. I also want to take a moment to do some quick housekeeping and orientation, which is neurodiversity affirming practice that I always infuse into all of my work, not just because it's good for everyone, but also as a way to model how you can effortlessly do that with the neurodivergent kids or adults in your life. So let's start by taking a look at your Zoom. Firstly, if you click on the three dots that are all the way over to the right next to the end button, there's an option to turn on captions for yourself. And it's not just for people who have hearing impairments or are hard of hearing, it's for anyone who needs them for any reason. So if you need to process information with seeing the words as well, you can turn on the captions for yourself. Secondly, somewhere in the middle of that same Zoom bar is a slightly tilted heart labeled react. So I'd love for you to take a moment to click on the caret, which is that little arrow next to it, and select recognize hand gestures. When it's on, it has a check mark next to it, and that enables it. It allows you to participate in some of the check for understanding that I'll do during this presentation, simply by clicking on the react button. I see some great reactions coming in, so you're doing it. You can use the appropriate reaction, and I promise you they are mostly work and kid friendly, which is great. And lastly, as Charlene mentioned, there's a chat icon to the left of that tilted heart, which is this way. And feel free to add things to the chat. I'll try and keep up. And as we said, there are other people monitoring it too. So this is another thing I'm going to do. Here's our conversational roadmap to keep you oriented and engaged, right? This is the roadmap of our conversation today. And almost every slide is going to have one of these pin icons in the upper left-hand corner. That pin will match the color and the number of the topic we're talking about. And I do that because it's a simple visual wayfinding tool that you can use in slides or sometimes even in daily life for kids, right? So when you have different visual schedules for the morning, or you have a schedule for the afternoon, or you have a schedule for the evening, you can color code them or you can number them and give them this kind of wayfinding to know where they are or what they can or should be or ought to be doing or hearing about. So you're going to see this map every time I change topics. And the topics we're going to cover tonight are what it can look like to feel accepted and supported, understanding the terms neurodiversity and neurodivergence, how language can create a sense of belonging and inclusivity, and creating empathetic spaces that champion neurodivergent kids. And I just love that word champion. I'm glad you're all here to champion with me. So let's get started for real, right? Okay. So when I talk about neurodiversity affirming, right, neurodiversity and neurodivergence, I'm truly talking about affirming everyone. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit. And that's because I believe really strongly in inclusion, but I believe even more strongly in belonging, right? And in my mind, inclusion is being able to be in the room, have a voice in the room or a place in the rooms, and I say rooms with quotation marks, or being at the table. Inclusion means that somebody or a group of somebodies has made the conscious decision or conscious decisions about who can be in that room and are aware of who they're including. To me, belonging is never having to consider whether you have a place or a voice, right? It's the ability to show up as yourself wherever you go without having to worry about being yourself, or if people know you'll be there, or thinking about why you shouldn't be there, perhaps. It's a nuanced difference, and both are important. I just aim to create a world where everyone belongs without having to overcome anything about themselves if they don't want to. And so let me talk about what that looks like for me, right? And I want to introduce myself a little bit more in depth because I think it will help ground us in how we spend the rest of our time together, right? So this is a little bit what the casual observer knows about me, right? And as I look at this picture, which is confident and presents this image of myself that I may not often see, I see this. I see what I've become, right? I'm a successful advocate. I'm an expert. I've written books. It's actually 6 now, which is amazing. I advocate for and help other people advocate for their students. I work with parents and do parent training and coaching to make neurodiversity affirming changes in their lives. I've even gone to Capitol Hill to advocate for, and also the Supreme Court to see what the education experience looks like for our neurodivergent students. But it is not where I started, and I haven't always felt that strong and fierce, and I know that not all of our kids feel that strong and fierce right now. So here's what I know about me. This image here, much more what I know about me than what that other image just projects, right? It's another way of looking at me. I have often felt on the inside unsure, scared, worried, helpless, and hopeless. At a very young age, I didn't have that path to self-acceptance. It's been a lifelong one. I grew up in a time where people were called quirky. I was a quirky kid. I spoke at a very, very young age. I began to read at a very early age. And people who know me will probably tell you I haven't stopped reading or speaking since then. But I also have significant sensory processing issues and anxiety. I don't have these typical visual spatial skills that you would expect or the related math skills. And I've spent a lot of time trying to understand people and mask and camouflage to imitate their behavior, right? And to this day, I still can't tell my left from my right, which is why when I said that way, I was pointing to you to the left because I needed that. No idea how I got through geometry class in high school. I can't see the hidden pictures on any of those hidden picture posters. And also, it means that I have fallen down more than a few flights of stairs if there's a pattern in the staircase, right? And I also always wear like the most comfortable clothing I can find and struggle to be around lots of people. You don't know it, but that's because I've learned like what I need for accommodations and support. So even right now, I'm wearing the most soft t-shirt I can find with no tags and a really comfortable cotton thing over it because I know what I need to be comfortable having conversations and to be myself. This is who I really am, right? I am proudly, loudly neurodivergent. Um, I'm goofy. I love a good pun. Anybody who knows me will know I know a good pun. I also love a good swear word, which you won't hear tonight, but that's part of who I am as well. And as I mentioned, I always wear the softest clothes possible. I'm the one who's going to ask you to turn the lights down in an office room. And the reason sort of that I can talk about all of this is because I had advocates who supported me, right? Whether because directly in helping me get what I needed or indirectly by being a person I could look up to and say, oh, I want to be like that. I want to be like that. The reason I do talk about all of this is because my path isn't just about me anymore. I have 3 children. They're 27, 22, and 14. And my husband and all of us are neurodivergent. I have an autistic son. I have an ADHDer. My husband has a language-based learning disability, ADHD. And we joke that if we ever get our own reality show, we're going to call it Neurons Gone Wild because our house is just Neurons Gone Wild. I do talk about this because my path is about my children, your children, the children I work with, and I want to make sure that they know how to become, right? And that's exactly it. I have been asked so many times, how did you overcome all of that? And the answer for me is it's not about overcoming, it's about becoming, right? I have become comfortable with who I am. I have become comfortable speaking up for what I need. And most importantly, I have become aware of the innovative strengths and resilience that I have gained from being neurodivergent. I don't mask anymore. I don't want to teach, I don't want to encourage other people to act like someone else who represent these norms. I don't want to hide my true self. It's confusing, it's exhausting, it takes a lot of energy, and it's a toll on my mental health. And I definitely don't want my kids or the kids that I work with or the kids that you have at home or the kids that you work with to think that they have to overcome who they are. I want them to become who they are. And so that power of one caring adult in a child's life, we talk about this a lot. It can't be underestimated, right? I want you all to know that when you start looking at creating neurodiversity affirming communities, not just classrooms, not just schools, but like entire communities, you're likely to become that caring adult. You're going to be the person that people look up to. And it may not be for your students, it may not be for your children, it may be for your coworkers, it may be for your relatives, it may be for your neighbors as well. So that's what it feels like to be accepted and supported, right? And I use myself as an example because I know what it feels like to be accepted and supported. And I'm hoping that we can create spaces that are empathetic and supportive for all people. So we are here. We're at the second, we're at understanding the terms neurodiversity and neurodivergence. Excuse me. So I do want to talk about terminology, but not in a boring way, right? So neurodiversity is having kind of a moment. If you're here, you know that neurodiversity is having a moment. And I hope that moment is gradually shifting to acceptance. And in that acceptance, I think a shared understanding of the words really, really matter. So let's talk about neurodiversity and neurodivergence. If you notice here, there's another icon in the right corner. And this icon, every time you see it, it's going to mean please drop your thoughts in the chat, right? And there's no right or wrong answers. There's no pressure to put your thoughts in the chat if you don't want to, but it gives you an opportunity. And I want to start with these two questions. What does neurodiversity mean to you? And or what does neurodivergent mean? Now I'm going to do something that in various workplaces I've worked at, they call it the Amanda pause, but really it's just a moment to give you time to process. So what does neurodiversity mean to you? And what does neurodivergent mean? Be looking at the chat. See some good answers starting to come in. Thank you. Thank you for all of these answers. Oh, I love the idea of a kaleidoscope. That's amazing. Kaleidoscope of different processes. Okay. I'm going to move on and I'm going to give you some thoughts. This slide often makes people think twice, right? 10 out of 10 people are neurodiverse, and approximately 2 out of 10 people are neurodivergent, right? This is surprising to a lot of people, and that's because it's about terminology. As people have begun to seek out more information and talk about neurodiversity in the mainstream, it's become part of all of our world, right? So various companies like Microsoft, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Dell Technologies, for example, they've all launched work initiatives and programs designed to recruit neurodiverse talent and thinkers. And that means something. Neurodiverse is important. LinkedIn has a skill badge of dyslexic thinker, which is very, very cool, right? And these programs promote this awareness of neurodiversity and the neurodiversity movement. But some advocates, myself included, are concerned that sometimes it makes it too easy to lose the distinction between neurodiversity and neurodivergence and when to use the words. So the word neurodiversity does not mean neurological disability. It's kind of like the idea of biodiversity. Before we started, I was just mentioning to the people behind the scenes that I was visiting my son in California. I live in Maine. Here in Maine, we have these beautiful types of plants and trees and all of these kinds of foliage and fauna. This time of year, it's beautiful. They're turning great colors. The foliage and fauna that my son has in California, very different than what we have here in Maine. And that's because it's biodiverse. There's this variety and variability of life forms that thrive in different kinds of environments, right? So my trees here would not thrive in California, and the cacti that he has in the desert would not thrive here in Maine. They thrive in certain environments, but it doesn't mean that some are better than others. If we look at this from this perspective and we sort of apply that to the brain, right? We think about the fact that all spaces that contain people, including schools, including communities, including homes, are neurodiverse because all people have nervous systems, right? And all of those nervous systems have degrees of variations in needs and disability and abilities. That means that 10 out of 10 people are neurodiverse. They help make up this world where everybody has different types of nervous systems. When we look at neurodivergence, and I use the stat 20% because it talks about things that are specifically diagnoses that we often use with neurodivergence, like ADHD, dyslexia, learning disabilities, other kinds of processing information. It's a good month to talk about this because it's ADHD Awareness Month. it's Learning Disabilities Awareness Month. It's a lot of these awareness months, right? That term neurodivergence, it refers to the variation in the human brain around things like socialization preferences, learning preferences and processing, attention, mood, and other cognitive skills. And when the needs of someone's nervous system differ from what we consider to be typical, and again, I want to use the quotation marks typical, it can make it more difficult for people to navigate those spaces than the general public would expect. That's neurodivergence, right? People often are wondering, why all of a sudden there are so many more neurodivergent people. And there are really a lot of answers for this. One of the best answers is people are starting to understand their own brains and they're starting to talk about it more and identify more. But the truth is, we have always been here. I talked about being called a quirky kid, right? I was a quirky kid because I didn't have an identification or a diagnosis or a label. Now we have earlier identification of neurodivergence, and the diagnoses and the labels and the assessments are sort of catching up with those who may have been unidentified in the past, right? Also, the stigma surrounding neurodivergent diagnoses is sort of waning a little bit, right? Many people, myself included, are not afraid to disclose their diagnoses, not just afraid to talk about how their brains work, and are doing it more publicly, right? And it brings awareness to neurodivergence to expanding circles of influence, whether that's family, whether it's friends, whether it's social media, other avenues, webinars like this one. The stigma is changing because we're talking more about it. Also, that first wave of neurodivergent children who were diagnosed like in the 1990s and 2000s, like my own older two children, they're in adulthood now and they are leading the charge on this front line of the neurodiversity movement. They are today's parents, teachers, researchers, and advocates, and they have the voice and power to get people to listen, right? They are this younger generation of neurodivergent Gen Zs and Gen Alphas. They've all grown up with this greater understanding of themselves, and they have an expectation of acceptance, and I love that. And that's growing. And that's one of the reasons I can say to you today, neurodiverse and neurodivergent mean different things to me. What I will also say is, whatever term you choose to use is totally fine too. I'm not telling you to use one or the other. I just wanted you to know that there's a difference in them and people are starting to change how they use them. So I talked about this a little bit, right? But I want to just really make it clearer, right? Neurodiversity is all spaces. It's all spaces, it's the people in them, and it's like biodiversity. I often tell this story of having gone to the Caribbean and seeing this little bird-like thing coming past us. And my 14-year-old was with us and he was like, "Mom, that looks like a chicken and it sounds like a duck and it moves like a duck, but it's speckled like a chicken." And we found out later it was a duck, but it was not the kind of duck that we were used to seeing, but it was still a duck. It was just a duck that thrived in a different environment. It's biodiversity, that variety and variability of life forms. So all spaces that contain people are neurodiverse because all people have nervous systems, right? Who have with these variations of needs and abilities. But when those needs brought about by someone's neurology differ from what we consider to be typical, can make it more difficult than we expect to navigate those spaces. And that's neurodivergence. Okay, I'm going to pause and I'm going to do a quick check-in. All right. So I want to know how you're feeling. I've thrown a lot of information at you really quickly. Please use your Zoom reaction buttons to let me know how you're understanding so far. Okay. If you have the got it, ready to learn, that's the yes button. Yeah, I see a lot of thumbs coming in, which is I'm with you, but I'm still processing the information. And I have the if they know it's that I have a question I absolutely need answered before we move on. I'm waiting to see if I have any no's come up. I don't think I did. Okay. But I am skipping through my slides because my brain just skipped in a way there. Okay. Okay. Some people don't have the green check or red option. Feel free to just drop in the chat and we have people monitoring. Okay. So far, we're doing okay, which is great. I'm really glad to see that this. So this neurodiversity movement is super important to me, right? And one of the things about the neurodiversity movement is it says neurodivergence doesn't have to be looked at as a deficit. I love this, right? Because what it does is it says neurodiversity recognizes that individuals have different needs and we provide resources and support tailored to those needs, right? In neurodivergent communities, it means access to specialized tools, maybe flexible work environments, flexible social environments, and leaders who understand how kids or adults with various neurotypes engage with the world around them, right? It challenges us to look at these differences as variations of the brain that don't need to be fixed or cured. It means creating environments that are inclusive and supportive of all types of brains, not just in schools, but across broader communities, workplaces, public spaces, social organizations. It's much more equitable than a one-size-fits-all approach, and it doesn't force neurodivergent individuals and kids especially to conform to standards and expectations that they may not only not understand, but that don't suit their unique ways of thinking and interacting, right? Neurodiversity affirming spaces adapt the environment to be more welcoming and accessible instead of asking neurodivergent people to adapt to the environment. It embraces the diversity that comes with all of these different neurotypes. It views struggles and strengths as both valuable and understands that neurodivergent people experience and interact with the world in really unique kinds of ways, right? And I'm biased here because I'm also neurodivergent, but I think it's really important to understand that those unique ways can both be exciting and challenging. And neurodiversity affirming communities and practices focus on living those strengths and talents of every individual, right? The goal isn't just equal participation for all kids, but the empowerment of all kids in a community to thrive where they excel. And in recognizing strengths, we can create more equitable spaces where neurodivergent kids can feel accepted, they can feel supported, and they feel like they have the capability to contribute meaningfully to the world around them. And that is an exciting thing to have happen, right? To feel like you belong. And that goes back to the idea of belonging. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit more about terminology for a minute, right? Because the language around neurodiversity is really complex and involving, and the preferences around how we use language varies really widely, right? Oftentimes, we talk about neurotypical. You may hear the word neurotypical to mean not neurodivergent. I tend to use the word neuronormative. And that's because there's this otherness in the use of the word neurotypical to describe people and traits that aren't neurodivergent, right? It kind of says there's a typical way of doing things that's usual or ordinary, and that you have to do them that way. But neuronormative puts forth this idea that there are standards or societal norms that are much more widely thought to be the way people should think or act. Neuronormative challenges this concept that those norms should be adhered to by a typical people, right? It advances the idea that there's norms that we expect people to adhere to, but it doesn't mean that they're typical. And so I don't, I would just encourage you to think about whether or not neuronormative is a word you want to start using instead of neurotypical. Okay. We are here now. We're going fast, but this is important too, right? I think it's really important to talk about this a little bit. I want to talk about how language can create a sense of belonging and inclusivity, right? Language can create belonging in ways that we've started to talk about a little bit. And so when I talk about terminology, and I say that terminology matters, it's not just the terms. It's how we speak about and with and listen to the kids in our lives that also helps us create more empathetic and accessible worlds, right? So starting with understanding neurodiversity versus neurodivergence versus neurotypical versus neuronormative, all of those words and understandings help bring us to places where we can be more empathetic and accessible, but also understanding how you talk about things matters too. This one's super important to me, right? Differences versus neurodivergent. And oftentimes we talk about differences. We talk about learning differences. We talk about um, thinking differently. We talk about how people are wired differently. We use this word different. And a lot of neurodivergent individuals may want to use the word different and differences to describe themselves instead of using neurodivergent or neurodiverse or even the specific diagnostic labels. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? For some, embracing differences is a form of empowerment. It gives them a way to positively own their unique traits and experiences and acknowledge them as integral parts of their identity, right? So I just want to acknowledge the fact that there's nothing wrong with the word differences, but the way I use the word different and differences, I use it currently because there's no other paradigm that allows for differentiation between what are considered neuronormative and neurodivergent traits. I use the terms neutrally to describe the unique sort of cognitive and perceptual experience of all individuals. We all have differences. We are all different from each other, and we all have differences in how we experience the world. I like using that term because it avoids sort of pathologizing things, and it acknowledges that we all have variations of experience in our lives, right? And it's one of the reasons to me that it's more urgent than ever to create neurodiversity affirming spaces is so we don't have to create these new words, that we have a shared language to talk about, right? And I want to go a little deeper into this because a lot of us are involved in schools in one ways for in another, right? Or we're involved in healthcare, we're involved in parenting, and we're going to hear all of these words. We're going to hear difference, we're going to hear disability, we're going to hear disorder, and it gets really sort of confusing to understand why. Why are these used differently? And I think it's important from both a school identification and medical diagnostic lens to understand these, right? When we talk about difference, again, it's about variability. And it's based on that social model of disability where it's not that the difference is disabling, it's that the systemic barriers or negative attitudes and societal views and exclusion are the main factors that create the idea of disability, right? Difference is when something stands out as being unlike what is considered typically normal, and it's apparent because of the environment that you're in. Disability is a legal concept. And if you think about that, you can hear it. You can hear it in the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, IDEA, right? Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act also uses the word disability. It's a legal concept in which sort of the consequences a person experiences on how their difference affects them in the environment gets in the way of functioning, right? When that difference makes it harder to function because of the situation of surroundings, we call that disability. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the word disability. I think some people are very uncomfortable with the word disability, but in the disability community, a lot of people are reclaiming that. They don't mind saying, I have a disability. They don't mind saying, I'm disabled. But what they do want is for people to understand that the accommodations and supports are to support what is not built into the environment that makes it hard for them to function in their situation. It's a legal concept, and it's also sort of an identity concept as well. Disorder is a medical term, right? And it's used for diagnosis. You think about ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That's because it's a medical diagnosis, right? It's a medical diagnosis, and it's a different version of the model of disability. It talks about when the difference interacts with the context of the environment and impairs functioning. It's a way of sort of looking at it being innate. And it says disorder is this how the condition affects how someone functions, and it has signs and it has symptoms. And it's from a medical model. That's how we talk about some of these neurodivergences and differences. I'm going to take a pause. Thumbs up if you're doing okay still, if you're still with me. Oh, no thumbs up, a couple of thumbs. Oh, right, there go the thumbs. Great. Um, if you're feeling great, give me the yes button. If you absolutely need something explained, please let me know now. Okay. All right. So that leads me to the idea of this neurodiversity affirming language, right? Neurodiversity affirming language, because words have power. Words have power. And I talk a lot about using neurodiversity affirming language in the environments that we're in. And one of the things it does is it presents information in a more neutral way. And I talk a lot about this being the difference between subjective and objective, right? So you can talk about what you're seeing in front of you in a way that puts value on it, right? That puts value on it and describes things that you're seeing in a way that puts your own perspective on it. Or you can describe exactly what you're seeing in front of you, that neutral information, right? Neurodiversity affirming language presents information more neutrally. It acknowledges strengths, it acknowledges needs, and it presumes competence. So by presuming competence, it means we presume that somebody is capable of participating in their own conversations, in their own ways, that they have their way of being intelligent, that they can show you what they know. All of these things that say we are presuming competence. Neurodiversity affirming language avoids using medicalized terms like disorder unless it's really necessary for legal reasons, and oftentimes uses the word condition instead. It uses the more neutral phrase of co-occurring instead of comorbidity. When a kid has more than one condition that impacts their learning, or an adult does, co-occurring is much more neutral than comorbid. And it describes specific support needs and strengths instead of using functioning labels. For example, sometimes you'll hear somebody talk about autism with the high functioning label, but instead neurodiversity affirming language uses things like low support needs in this situation or this environment and names the situation and the environment. And neurodiversity affirming language also avoids using phrases like this person suffers from anxiety, because we want to make it clear that being neurodivergent is not a tragic condition. I do not find myself a tragic person. I do find myself sometimes a dramatic person, but I do not find myself a tragic person. I don't suffer, I am. And I think that's important in neurodiversity affirming language. So that gives you the opportunity to sort of change our lens on language, right? How we talk about behavior in our kids is a clue to whether we're approaching them with compassion and care. And when we move from that deficit-based language to neutral or strengths-based language, it's important. So think about how times you say things, right? So sometimes you might be like, oh, this kid is misbehaving or they are acting out. But what if you change that to this kid is really struggling with the ability to pay attention and they're having trouble meeting the expectations? That's different than misbehaving. What if we said instead of acting out, they're reacting to something? What are they reacting to? Can we think about that instead? Um, as a parent, I know I've said a bazillion times, oh my gosh, my child decided they are not going to, or they chose to, and then put some negative thing on there. And then I have to rethink that and say, actually, my child they need to learn the skills to be able to do something, or that are unable to meet this expectation because there's something that I need to think about. Um, how many of you have used the term, oh, they're just looking for attention? I think many, many of us have. What if you flip that to, they're looking for connection? They're looking for connection. When we use this language, when we move from the deficit-based language to neutral or strength-based, we are much more likely to see the possibilities of our children instead of seeing our children as problems or having problems. I love the idea of possibility versus problems. It doesn't mean there are things that aren't going to be challenging, but it does mean that we can see solutions. It makes us much more solutions-oriented to change our lens on language. A lot of information to process, right? So we're going to take a brain break. This is also really good practice for neurodiversity affirming. So when that comes down, we're going to breathe in, breathe out. Put your feet on the floor, breathe in. Okay, I feel calmer. If you don't feel calmer, you can keep going, but I feel calmer. I feel more ready to process. I feel like my brain is more energized to move on. So here's a moment for you to reflect. And if you don't have an answer, that's fine. This is the chat icon again. I want you to drop your thoughts in the chat, and there are no wrong or right answers. We are going to talk about language a lot. And one of the big debates in education is whether we should be using person first or identity first language when referring to neurodivergent individuals and kids and students. And I'm just super curious, do you use identity first or person first language? I see someone saying that it's a struggle to break the habit, and I think that's right. I think it's right. It is always a struggle to break habits. I appreciate all of you answering. I see a lot of good answers coming in. So I'm going to give you one person's perspective, okay? Here's one, whoops, boy, my neurodivergence in executive functioning is through and through having some difficulties right now. Here's one person's perspective. They said, and this is from the upcoming book, being neurodivergent has shaped who I am. And I don't know what it's like to be any other version of myself. I don't know what it's like to be a person without neurodivergent traits. And I have a fundamental problem with the reasoning of person first language asking us to remember that I am a person first. In fact, it concerns me that we must consciously keep in mind that someone is a person first. This is my perspective. I just want to say that. This is my perspective. This is what I said when I was asked this question. I don't know what it's like to be any other version of me. Being neurodivergent is just part of who I am. I'm a person who's neurodivergent, and I use the word neurodivergent to describe myself, right? But like you and others in education and related fields, I was taught to use person first language. A kid with autism, a child with ADHD, a learner who has dyslexia. But a lot of neurodivergent self-advocates, myself included, often prefer identity first language, referring to ourselves as things like dyslexic or autistic or ADHDers or AUDHDers, which is AUDHDers. That's people who have ADHD and autism, AUDHDers. And it's because we recognize that as neurodivergent people, we can't be separated from our neurodivergence, right? It's part of who we are. It's part of our personality. It's part of our community. It's part of our culture. And using identity first language recognizes it. There isn't a way to separate a person from their neurodivergence because without it, they'd be a totally different person. And that's the idea behind neurodivergent and identity first language. But as a lot of you said in the chat, I always defer to the individual and their preference. And you'll hear me using identity first language because it's my preference. But if somebody said to me, I prefer person first language, that is absolutely how I would talk with them. And the question here, the big idea is, should we be using person first or identity first language when referring to neurodivergent kids? And the answer is to ask them. You can only defer to an individual's preference if you ask them, right? Okay. So lots of information, and we are here. We're getting to the last part of this about how do you create those empathetic spaces that champion neurodivergent kids? And I love the word champion because it's not just empower, it's not just set them up for success, it is champion them. How are you going to be the person who really makes the world more accessible and more empathetic, and you're going to stand up and champion them? I think it's a great word to use right after the Olympics, too, a champion, right? So some of these actionable strategies to build empathetic spaces are really cool, right? And I would like to say we start by destigmatizing neurodivergence, which of course, simple solution, right? Not so simple. But as we implement principles to destigmatize, it sort of impacts the wider world, right? We grow a community of people who have a greater understanding of neurodivergence. And that first part for me is to stop fearing the labels. We worry about labels. We worry about labeling. We worry about it following us. We worry about all those things. But I think the first step towards destigmatizing is to call things what they are, right? We need to stop using euphemisms to avoid naming things as they are. We don't want to keep calling kids a bit different, quirky, like I was called quirky. We don't want to call them off, neurotypical, neurodivergent. The messages that these terms send is that being neurodivergent is something to be ashamed of and something to hide, right? Every time we don't give a child a label to talk about how their brain is working, they are internalizing some other label that anyway. And oftentimes that label is lazy, dumb, unworthy, something really negative about themselves. So if we don't call it what it is, we might be giving them labels that they are using for themselves anyway. So if a student is struggling to learn to read and may have dyslexia or language-based learning disability, it's really important to help them understand what that label is and understand why that skill is so hard. When we educate students and kids about their neurological differences, and not just kids who have them, all kids, we help them understand not only what's making it hard for them to learn, but also understand that there are tools that can help their brains, right? A second thing is to start normalizing accommodations. And when I say normalize accommodations, I mean accommodations for everyone, right? When they're made available for everyone, because they are good for all kids, right? We have accommodations that we make for our families and stuff all of the time. I just mentioned that I just went on a trip. I have a very specific routine for going through security because I travel a lot for work. And I have it down to a T and might get very dysregulated when my family doesn't follow that routine. We have learned that the accommodation we need to make as a family is I go through security and I meet people on the other side, and that keeps everybody regulated and it's accommodating everybody, right? A major barrier to accessing accommodations is the fact that they're not readily available or accessible in many situations, right? And so self-advocacy becomes a really hard skill to learn when they don't have opportunities, kids don't have opportunities to learn how to self-advocate. When we help kids learn what accommodations work for them, how, where they can access them, and what to expect when they ask for them, it's important to consider that request. It's important to give them the space to do that and either meet the request or if you can't for some reason, to offer different alternatives or suggestions or explain why you can't. When kids are shut down, when they ask for support, they learn not to ask. And when those accommodations are denied, neurodivergent kids learn it's better to hide their needs than to meet them, right? I think it's really important to note that all of those accommodations could be supportive to students. I have a fidget right here. I'm not using it right now, but I use it all the time on calls. And I know that other people that I have worked with have started putting fidgets at their desks too, because it makes them calm. And it's not necessarily because they have neurodivergent brains. It's just because it helps them. I think the other thing we can do too is to start questioning that status quo, right? We do a lot of things in this world because it's the way it's always been done. In education specifically, right? Time tests, group projects, discipline systems, they've always been part of this ecosystem since before most of our educators were even in school. Some things change, right? Fads come and they fads go, but like some things don't. And when we're creating a neurodiversity affirming world, we need to ask ourselves, why do we do it this way? Why is the answer no? Why can I say yes? When we do things the way we do them, because that's the way we do them, there may be a better answer. Becoming neurodiversity affirming and accessible and empathetic often requires a change in thinking about why we do the things we do. Ask the questions, see if there are new ways to do things. We can also have a shared commitment towards change, and we will change the world because it makes us stronger together. So I mentioned 6 books, right? How do we create a culture that builds neurodiversity affirming, empathetic, and accessible spaces that champion our kids? Emily Kirscher Morris and I, Emily Kirscher Morris, has a specialty in twice exceptionality and neurodivergence. She spoke for this series last season, maybe coming back for this season, I'm not sure. We wrote a book together. We have a new book coming out called Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices So All Students Feel Accepted and Supported. And one of the things we decided this book needed was a neurodivergent learner's Bill of Rights. And you folks are amongst the first people to see this and even see what we decided needed to be in that Bill of Rights. And I want you to understand that when I say learners, I mean all kids. It's not just in school, it's across the board. So here's another way we can start championing it is by looking at the Neurodivergent Learner Bill of Rights. The first is the right to inclusivity, right? All neurodivergent kids have the right to be educated in an inclusive environment that values and respects their neurodivergence. You could also say they deserve to live in a home that values and respects their neurodivergence, in communities that value and respect their neurodivergence. They have the right to accommodations. We just talked about that a little bit. And it respects unique learning styles. And I don't mean that everybody has one learning style. I mean styles of learning, right? It respects needs and promotes personal and academic growth. It might be assistive technology. It might be assessments. It might be all these things, but we deserve the right to accommodations, the right to be understood and valued for their unique neurological wiring. Certain traits, fidgeting, stimming, tapping, they may be coping mechanisms or forms of communication, not something to change. The right to participate actively in decisions that affect them, including IEP meetings, 504 meetings, other relevant forums like doctor's appointments. The right to personal preference, right? The right to express and exercise their personal preferences. I often tell people when we talk about kids who spend time alone, there is a difference between alone and lonely. Let them tell us that. Let them tell us what they choose to do. What's their preferred method of engagement? The right to advocacy, right? All neurodivergent kids have the right to learn about, understand, and advocate for their unique needs. In all situations, it's designed to empower them, right? As parent advocates, our job is to put ourselves out of a job by teaching our kids to be advocates, fostering their self-determination, and giving them the opportunity to fully participate in their lives. And the last is, I think all neurodivergent learners, and Emily agrees because we put this in the book, have the right to respect, the right to be free from harassment, bullying. It's also National Bullying Awareness Month, to be free from harassment, bullying, and discrimination based on their neurodivergence, right? It means the right to confidentiality and privacy. It also means that all students everywhere should be educated about neurodiversity, all people, so the expectation to adapt doesn't fall solely on our neurodivergent kids. And that's a great segue into saying, if you have questions, I want to make sure that you protect privacy as you put questions into these things. And I'm going to kick it back to Charlene, who's going to do some of our question and answer right now.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda Morin. That was incredible. We have had so much, and boy, this was an emoji fest, wasn't it, everyone? We did a lot. Thank you for those pauses. We haven't seen that before. That was a really nice break again for everybody, right? Accommodations work for everyone. So thank you for that. And boy, we have some really good questions coming in. So let's do this sort of speed dating style, Amanda. We're going to start with a great one. Question is, Amanda, when you look back on middle or high school, what would you have liked your teachers to have done differently? Or would you have wanted to be supported with your neurodiversity?
Such a great question. And I really want to be clear in saying that I went to school, not, when I started school, it was just about 5 years into the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. So I started when all the teachers were starting to learn too. So I think there are changes that could have been made, but teachers didn't know what they were yet, right? I think what I would have liked people to know is I was paying attention, even if though I didn't look like I was paying attention, that I could take in information quicker than they thought I could. There were so many times that I turned in tests and my teacher were like, "Are you sure you don't want to like take a look at that again?" And the answer was no, I didn't, because I had read it really quickly and I had done it the way I needed to. I just would have liked for them to understand that not all students had to look the same. And I had some great teachers who did understand that. Um, yeah,
Okay, that's a great answer. I love that. All right, you have done this, but if you would, Amanda, one more time quickly, explain the difference as you see it between neurodiversity and neurodivergence.
absolutely. So neurodiversity refers to everyone, right? We all have neurological wiring. We all have ways of experiencing the world. Neurodiversity is everyone. It's like biodiversity. Neurodivergence is when the ways that our brains are wired get in the way of functioning in some way, right? How we experience or interact with the world makes interacting or experiencing with the world a little more challenging, right? So dyslexia, the ability to work with language or learning how to read or those kinds of things. My sensory um system is a little bit different from other people's. So like I have to change the lights, I have to decompress in different ways. That's neurodivergence. So neurodiversity is all people. Neurodivergence is when that wiring gets a little bit in the way of how you function in ways that make the world less challenging for you.
All right, thank you for that.
Sure.
You mentioned sensory issues. So here's a question about that. What resources are out there for neurodiverse people who have sensory issues? Are they curable or managed?
Ooh, so there are a lot of resources, right? And I always point to understood.org, not just because I worked on understood.org, but because I think they have a variety of experts who come at things from a variety of different perspectives. Um, there are resources to manage, right? Cured, I don't know about. I think people manage and grow in and out of different kinds of things. There are occupational therapy is a really great resource for a lot of kids to get a sensory profile and understand. And we'll put in place a sensory diet. It's not an actual food diet. It's a diet of like, what are the things that you can do with your body to understand how you need to interact with the world, fidgets or how you need to do heavy work or those kinds of things. So occupational therapy is a really good resource. Um, Making sure that you are able to understand that sensory information comes at us from all of these different ways, and you may not see what it is that your child is reacting to, but to ask them that question gives you an opportunity to start thinking about what are the accommodations and adaptations you can make.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Here's a good question. How do you recommend sharing a diagnosis with a child?
Oh, that is a great question. I mean, I think age appropriateness is important, right? So I think I always have approached it from a positive perspective first, right? To be able to say everyone's different, they experience the world in different ways. We have different things going on, and sometimes there is a name for what is how you interact with the world. That's not grammatically correct, but it's a good try, right? So, for my kids, my two children who are autistic, I've always just explained to them what autism means and how other people think of it versus how it affects them, right? So starting to talk about that, just being really clear that everybody has challenges, everybody has needs, everybody has strengths, and to start talking about it and tell people that a diagnosis is not telling our kids a diagnosis has nothing to do with who they are. It just is a way of talking about what people see about them is a really good way to do that sometimes too.
Okay, thank you. That really is very helpful to hear that, Amanda. All right, here's a good question. What do you think about neurodivergent affirming applied behavior analysis?
I think it's complicated. I think that's the first thing I would say. I think it's complicated. And in my experience, the best I can say is I am listening to the adults who are coming out of that having had ABA. And I am also listening to their positive experiences and their negative experiences. I'm not a behavioral specialist, so I don't want to speak too much to that, but I just want to listen to people and affirm everybody's experience there.
Okay, so here's a question that I'm sure that families have run across. Parent asks, how do I ask for an accommodation for my teen when the 504 coordinator tells me her success in classes suggests that accommodations are not necessary in the classroom?
The first question is, why are they not necessary? Provide me with the data that says they are not necessary. I'm a big believer in data. Can you show me that they are not necessary? And I think the other thing is to go in and ask the question, what other accommodation would you suggest? Is there something else that you think is necessary? Because what you're doing then is you're opening up a dialogue about the fact that accommodations, everybody agrees they're necessary. But what we need to understand is what does that look like? And to talk about what does success look like? How do we get to success? So it may not be the exact accommodation, but like looking backwards from success, how do we get to success? But also to say, let me tell you why this accommodation is necessary. And if I can't tell you why, let my child help tell you why, right? Because kids are sometimes the best at explaining why that accommodation is helpful to them.
Okay, good advice. Good advice. Amanda, you have done this, but again, if you would briefly clarify person first versus identity first language.
So person first language is a concept that says we want to make sure that we don't put the diagnosis as the emphasis, right? So we talk about a child with autism, a child who has ADHD, a person who experiences anxiety. What you're doing is you're talking about a person first, literally person first, right? And what it does is it separates the condition from the person. Identity first language is often like a reclaiming of the word, right? And what people will do is they will call themselves autistic because it's part of who they are. They will say they're dyslexic because it's part of who they are, right? So there are conditions that are medicalized and can be managed that we use as person first. We wouldn't, sometimes you'll hear people say they have diabetes, and sometimes you'll hear people say they're diabetic. And that's the difference between person first, people who say they have diabetes is person first language. People who say they're diabetic, it's identity first language. It's part of who they are, and they integrate it into their identity. I hope that clarifies. I'm happy to try a little bit more, but let me.
That's okay. We all are learning here, and we're
Yeah,
just gonna, again, as you say,
yeah,
language is very important,
it
but
is.
there's a
Yeah.
learning curve.
There's absolutely a learning curve. And Charlene, the one thing I really want to say is it's okay. That's our learning curve, right? And I think that's really important to note. We are not always going to get it right. We're not always going to understand it, but trying is the important thing, right? And being able to reflect and correct is really important too. So, like, I don't think everybody should walk away saying, I got this and I can do this right now. I just want to make sure people have an understanding of the variety of language out there.
Exactly. All right, we have just a few minutes left together, but let's see if we can get to a couple more questions.
Sure.
We'll try one. This is a good one. At what age would you share with your child that they have ADHD?
I would think I would share it with them as soon as they start feeling like they're different, right? So when kids feel like there is something wrong about them, or they say that, they feel like their brain is fast or something like that, I think it's important to start talking about why that is. And I think you can talk about that in a variety of ways, but to really validate the fact that what they're experiencing is real is very important. And there are really good kids books about that. I'm seeing them come up in the chat. There's some great recommendations
Okay.
up in the chat.
Okay. Here's a really wonderful question, and I thank you to the writer because they actually summarized their question. It comes with pain, and I think this is important. Question is, put another way, what would a neurodivergent adult child like to hear from a parent who did not recognize neurodivergence during their childhood?
Oh, so I was that child. And I think, oh wow, I didn't know I was going to get all choked up here. I think a neurodivergent child probably just wants to hear you are absolutely okay the way you are. There is, there are people who will think there are things wrong, and I put that in quotation marks, wrong with you, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with the way your brain works. It makes you interesting, it makes you exciting, it makes things hard for you, but you are you, and I love you for the you that you are.
Thank you, Amanda. It's really beautiful, and I think it's a very common experience. All right, we have just a minute left, so I'm going to ask you my final question, which is, what message would you like to leave parents, caregivers, and educators with tonight?
I'd like to leave them with the idea that creating a neurodiversity affirming space, empathetic spaces, it is a learning curve, right? And what you do today doesn't mean you can't change it tomorrow or the next day or the next day. And for parents in particular, I think it's really important to realize that like one moment in time isn't going to define your child's entire future. You can do something today and you can continue to change and evolve, and your child will be all the better for it, and you will too. I think evolution is the way we create a more empathetic and accessible world.
Those are beautiful words to end with tonight. Amanda Morin, it has been such a pleasure and an honor to have you with us tonight. You handled kicking off season 2 very eloquently and with great content and courage. So we appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
everybody, for being on with us tonight, and our partners from the Riley Project and Real 2E and the Parent Venture. So thank you, everyone, for this. And again, when we finish the program, a little Zoom survey is going to pop up. We hope you'll tell us what you thought. But, I think the hearts and the thumbs up tell you everything, Amanda. We really appreciate you. We are very excited to welcome you all to the Neurodiversity Education Series. Take care, everybody, and hope to see you again soon. Good night.